Not
that
true.
flew into D.C. in early January of 2021 is now being followed around by the U.S. Marshals on airplanes, and there are no U.S. Marshals on the FAA on the
Okay.
airplanes all across the
Jake,
country because of this label.
you're doing a lot of whataboutism and changing
This
topics.
isn't what.
In this video, David Pakman speaks with the infamous QAnon shaman. Obviously, the topic of conversation between David Pakman and the QAnon shaman is about January 6th and what constitutes a riot. With that, let's watch the QAnon shaman drop nukes on woke idiot David Pakman.
It was again?
Well, it's actually, if you look at it objectively,
Yes.
you look at the setup that was very clearly there from a very early stage prior to January 6th, what you're going to find is that largely the parties responsible would be people like Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, Yogananda Pittman, Mark Milley in the Pentagon, Christopher Wray in the FBI, and people in Antifa and BLM.
How do you know that any of that is true? What evidence do you have, for example, that Nancy Pelosi was involved in what happened that day?
Well, because if you look into the testimony of former Capitol Police Chief Sund, he had his emergency powers revoked by Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell prior to the January 6th events, and they had to go. He had to go through them in order to deploy the National Guard. And when he gave the written request for National Guard to be present, they denied it because it would be bad optics and there was lack of evidence. But the evidence was all there. He was just not given the evidence by Yogananda Pittman, by the FBI, and by the Pentagon. And that's according to his own testimony. That's also according to the testimony of former Capitol Police Lieutenant Tarek Johnson.
Yeah, I've reviewed their testimony and was not able to find that. It's sort of beyond the scope of this interview to look at it line by line. I guess big picture, Jake, why do you think that parties that supported Joe Biden would try to interfere with Joe Biden being made president? Why would they do that? It seems counterproductive, doesn't it?
Well, the thing is what you have to understand is that it was about creating a setup so that a psyop may ensue and the weaponization of the Justice Department, the DOJ, could then be used to go after Trump and his supporters.
But
Pakman's such a condescending douche. I keep forgetting this guy's name. I should be more respectful, but the QAnon shaman said, you know, this is a psyop, giving the government reason to go after Donald Trump and his supporters. Something I've wanted to mention for a while and just see what anybody watching this thinks about this theory I have. And I say this theory I have, I'm sure I didn't come up with it. I probably heard it somewhere else, but I think if January 6th hadn't happened because there were ongoing legal challenges to the election at that time, that the certification of the election could be delayed. So all this stuff we hear about Nancy Pelosi turning away extra security, National Guard, all the FBI informants, Ray-Eps, and all of the new information we're learning, while I do think all of that I just described, even as I say it out loud, screams psyop, I also wonder if there was a motivation, instead of stopping the certification, there was a motivation to stop the challenge to the certification and to the election results. Because after January 6th, they rushed to certify the election and used January 6th as a justification to certify the election without letting all of these legal challenges be settled. While I used to say, for a long time, I would say, you know, I don't know what was going on January 6th. I didn't feel like I had enough evidence to claim one way or the other. But like I said, with everything that we know now, whether it was a psyop or something similar or both to what I mentioned, there was definitely something going on there. There's just too many oddities with the case. But would you guys please let me know in the comments if you think there's any merit to my theory or the theory I've created through what I've heard from other people. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
That's just a word salad, Jake. It doesn't address the crux of the question, does it?
No, it does. It does.
How?
And just allow me to address it. So Because of the events of January 6th, there
Yeah.
have been multitudes, thousands of Trump supporters that have been labeled domestic terrorists. And
Because they
because of
showed
that,
up and committed crimes, though, right? Or
well,
you're
well,
saying
well,
they were
no, but
tricked
that's
into
not.
doing so?
But with respect, David, that's not the same thing as committing acts of domestic terrorism in the way that there has been acts of domestic terrorism committed, say, for over 200 days all over the country during the 2020 riots by Antifa and BLM, who claimed in their own on their own websites that they wanted to overthrow the
But
American
Jake,
capitalist
that's a
system
non
and
sequitur.
install a
That's I
communist
have to
government.
interrupt Jake. I have to interrupt Jake because what you have to understand is imagine that I was accused of attempted murder. It is of no importance whatsoever if a year prior someone else somewhere else also tried to kill someone. I can't use that as my defense. And what you're saying is that part of the defense of what the people on January 6th did is your perception of what BLM did a year earlier. That's not a valid defense.
No, no. What I'm saying, dude, is this.
Okay.
What we're talking about here is optics. Okay. And they tried to make me in particular look as bad as humanly possible. They used all sorts of trigger words and trigger images to put a label on me and many other Trump supporters to circumvent our constitutional rights and to basically centralize power and use the levers of power in government to go after their political opponents.
Okay.
And they
Let
have
me
the
ask you a real
audacity to call
practical
us
question about that.
fascists.
You're talking
that?
about being designated domestic terrorists. I want to be super specific here because I really
What he said wasn't a non sequitur, David. It's very relevant because you had the Democrat Party bailing people out during BLM and Antifa riots, and some members of the Democrat Party fully encouraging these people to burn down the cities. Not to mention, the folks in those riots actually claimed that they wanted to tear down the government. I've said this 100 times on this channel, but the FBI plants on the ground during January 6th reported in real time and said, this wasn't planned, it just happened. So everyone that broke a law there, I absolutely agree they should face punishment for it. But as the QAnon shaman says here, there's a big difference between being charged with a crime and being labeled a domestic terrorist. Not to mention the outrageous sentences. The leader of the Proud Boys, I don't know a ton about him, but he wasn't even there, and he's facing 20 years in prison. Does that make any sense whatsoever? I was watching Tim Pool, and he said that someone he knows has been held for 3 months with zero due process. That's how they're treating these people. But people like Kamala Harris were contributing to the Minnesota Freedom Fund to bail out Antifa and BLM members. So it's very relevant as the events happened back to back. One was a very short amount of time. One was over an entire summer. One of them firebombed police stations, killed people, burnt things to the ground, cities to the ground. And do you hear any of them being labeled as domestic terrorists? Was it covered like crazy? All the individuals, like the QAnon shaman's talking about, how they're specifically targeting him in the news and, creating a narrative about the type of person that he is. It just didn't happen. So, and David, you're so freaking condescending. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
I understand your view on this. These cases like yours were federal cases. There is no official designation of domestic terrorism by the U.S. federal government. So who labeled you as such and where?
The Mockingbird media did all over the news, number one. And number two, are you telling me that when, say, the government is designating institutions like, say, the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers as domestic terrorist groups, or anybody for that matter that was flying into D.C.? I don't know if you're aware, but anybody that flew into D.C. in early January of 2021 is now being followed around by the U.S. Marshals on airplanes, and there are no U.S. Marshals on the FAA, on the airplanes all across the country because of this label.
You're doing a lot of whataboutism and changing topics.
This isn't
Let's
whataboutism,
just
these are
try. Hold on,
facts.
Jake. Hold on. Let's
Facts.
conduct this interview in a sensible way. Okay. Let's stick with one of the things you said. When we finish with it, we'll go to the next thing. Okay. You said that many of the people charged for their alleged involvement on January 6th have been designated as domestic terrorists by the weapon.
If you like watching videos like this one, like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Let's get back to the video.
Weaponized DOJ. I then said to you, there is no such designation by the U.S. government in the legal proceedings that you're talking about. So what do you mean they were designated domestic terrorists by the weaponized DOJ? You said, well, the Mockingbird media did it. So are you ready on... Hold on.
You talked about me.
Let me finish the question.
You said, who labeled you that?
Fine.
And that's what I'm saying. Well, the Mockingbird media did.
You first said that the weaponized DOJ issued that label. When I told you no such label exists, you said it was actually the media. So from a legal standpoint, no one has designated
you're mixing
you.
it up. That's not the case at all.
Okay.
What it is that I was saying
Tell me again.
What it is that I'm saying is that the DOJ has labeled numerous Trump supporters that were there on January 6th, and some people that weren't even there on January 6th, as domestic terrorists. And you
labeled
can
them
look
how
into,
and where?
And I'll tell you, you can look into the testimony of Stephen Friend, the FBI whistleblower who came forward and was talking about how it is that the FBI is designating these people as domestic terrorists and then handing these cases to FBI field offices all over the country, instead of treating it like it was one incident on one day at one location. And in this way, they're actually expanding their domestic terrorism investigations all over the country, creating the illusion that there is some sort of domestic terrorism threat from white.
Nothing David Pakman talks about is any attempt to try to really understand the person he's interviewing. It's all about his vernacular and did he express what he was saying, meaning his interviewee. Is this person articulating what they're trying to say exactly the way I want them to? And that's why he always does that crap like, we need to move on from this conversation, or you're getting off topic, or that's a non sequitur. I think that the QAnon shaman here gave a very good response that the whistleblower said the FBI designated these folks as domestic terrorists, and they ramped up their efforts throughout the country to quote unquote find more domestic terrorists so they could add to and spin their narrative more effectively. But we want to know what you think. What do you think about this conversation between David Pakman and the QAnon shaman here? Let us know. Anyway, that's it for this video. As always, we really appreciate you watching, and we will see you on the next one.